Good afternoon, everyone. We hope this finds you and yours keeping safe and well. Thank you very much for joining this Friends of Ocean Action webinar in partnership with the Environmental Justice Foundation. My name is Gemma Parks, your facilitator today, and I am the communications lead for Friends of Ocean Action, a group of more than 55 global leaders across different sectors who are committed to fast-tracking bold solutions for a healthy ocean and to achieving the Sustainable Development Goal for the Ocean, SDG 14. In today's webinar, we are focusing specifically on the impact of harmful fisheries subsidies on small-scale artisanal fishers and their communities and livelihoods. This discussion is timely and urgent. There are less than 2 months left for the World Trade Organization to meet the deadline enshrined in Sustainable Development Goal 14 to put in place the framework necessary to eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies. This is a negotiation that has been going on for an epic 80% of the WTO's existence, which means nearly 2 decades. And we strongly believe that it would be a fitting celebration of the 25th anniversary year of the WTO to conclude this deal once and for all. So to be clear, Target 6 of SDG 14, which along with the other SDGs was committed to unanimously by all world leaders, specifically and explicitly pledges to eliminate those harmful fisheries subsidies by 2020. And often people are led to believe that fisher people are opposed to SDG 14.6, this target, in other words, against the elimination of harmful fisheries subsidies. But the reality is the opposite. As World Bank statistics inform us, 91% of fishers and fish workers around the world are employed in small-scale artisanal fisheries. 90% of small-scale fishers live in developing countries, and up to 95% of small-scale fisheries landings are destined for local human consumption. This is a constituency that is far too significant to ignore, and SDG 14.6 is a target that would benefit small-scale fishers because the vast majority of harmful fisheries subsidies go to large industrial fleets, thus distorting small-scale fishers' access to resources and markets. Now, we know that artisanal fisheries are being discussed within the WTO negotiating group. And as we shall see today, small-scale artisanal fishers in West Africa and around the world are eager to see WTO negotiations conclude successfully because their livelihoods and the very survival of their communities are at stake. Now, we have a fantastic panel of speakers for today's webinar, organized in partnership with the Environmental Justice Foundation, whose founder and executive director, Steve Trent, is with us. Good afternoon, Steve. Steve has over 30 years experience in environmental and human rights campaigning, leading high-impact advocacy, communications campaigns, and field projects, alongside investigations into environmental crimes and abuses in over 40 countries. Steve will introduce a film produced this summer in the fishing town of Elmina, Ghana, which is being screened for the first time today. Nana Jojo Solomon, former chief fisherman in Elmina, who we'll see in the film in just a moment, is also with us directly from Ghana. Good afternoon, Nana, and we're very grateful that you can be here. You're a long-standing executive member of the Ghana National Canoe Fishermen Council with over 40 years in fishing. As a fisher, you have worked in both the semi-industrial and artisanal sectors of Ghana's fisheries and represent the artisanal fishers on the National Fisheries Association of Ghana's Council as an executive member, among many other affiliations. And I'm sure people will be very keen to speak with you after they see the film. We did also reach out to the Ghanaian mission in Geneva. They were unfortunately unable to attend today, but are following what's happening. Also with us today, we have Brian O'Riordan, who is the Executive Secretary of the LIFE Platform, or the Low Impact Fishers of Europe, an umbrella organization run by fishers for fishers based in Brussels, Belgium. And LIFE has the aim, as I read from your website, Brian, to provide a clear and coherent voice at EU level for the previously mainly silent majority of European fishers who are smaller scale and who use low impact fishing gears and methods, but have historically lacked dedicated and effective representation in Brussels and at member state level. Brian is also a former fisherman and brings a unique perspective to today's discussion. We are also delighted to be joined by Christelle Pratt, Assistant Secretary General for Environment and Climate Action at the Organization of the African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OACPS, also based in Brussels, and part of Christelle's mission is specifically ocean governance and fisheries. Christelle comes from the Pacific, where until recently she was Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, and has only recently taken up her position at the OACPS Secretariat. Of course, the ACP group of 79 countries plays a very significant role in the WTO negotiations, as do all small island developing states, such as those in the Pacific. So we're extremely eager to hear from you. And last but by no means least, with us also is Ambassador Peter Thompson, the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for the Ocean and co-chair of Friends of Ocean Action. And as a Fijian, another strong voice from the Pacific. Peter needs no further introduction, as I'm sure his is a familiar voice to all of us in all things just, sustainable ocean management for healthy people and planet. Thanks for being with us today also, Peter. Now, this is the 5th Friends of Ocean Action webinar on harmful fisheries subsidies, and we've heard from many different stakeholders over the last months, and today it's the turn of small-scale fishers. This session is open to the wider public, so please feel free to tweet or otherwise report on what is being said. Please tag, where possible, both Friends of Ocean Action and EJ Foundation, and at WTO to highlight that it's World Trade Organization members who hold the outcome in their hands. We use the hashtags Stop Funding Overfishing, Real in the Deal, and Harmful Fisheries Subsidies, as well as Ocean Action and SDG 14+, which, by the way, symbolizes the fact that a healthy ocean supports the achievement of other sustainable development goals, from ending hunger and poverty to boosting job security and health and well-being. So we often refer to SDG 14+. Please note today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available afterwards. Before we watch the film, Steve Trent from the Environmental Justice Foundation, it would be fantastic if you can just briefly please share with us the history of this project and a little about what your organization is doing with small-scale fishers around the world. Steve, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to say a few words to you. And my thanks to the organisers, Friends of Ocean Action. I'm going to keep my comments simple and to the point because I think others can speak with more authority on this issue than I can. EJF works in multiple geographies globally to research, investigate and advocate against illegal and unsustainable and unethical fisheries. And central to our work in this is a long-term close engagement with local communities and artisanal fishers in developing world countries, such as Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, but also in countries across Southeast Asia and East Asia. Our goal in this is primarily to help give these fishers and communities a voice in the decisions that are taken over their lives and over fishery resources. And that may be local, national, or indeed international as we are today. The key point of my message today is to say that over the past 2 decades that we've been conducting this work, I've seen again and again coastal communities and fishers experience profound negative impacts from the activities of industrial fishing vessels, many of which are only active and working in competition to artisanal fishers because of unfair, damaging, and very often hidden subsidies. We've also repeatedly documented some of these subsidized vessels, such as many of those operating in the waters of Ghana, that will be subject to the film we're about to see, fishing illegally and unsustainably. And as a result of the unfair advantages that these larger boats have, many communities, often among the poorest and most vulnerable, experience declining livelihoods, increased poverty, diminished food security, and multiple social problems arising from economic deprivation. And I think it is fair to say there is no escaping the robust fact that fishery subsidies are driving profound hardships across large numbers of our world's poorest coastal communities. And I'd like to close my very brief presentation with just reflecting again on some of the figures that Gemma mentioned in her introduction. And that's to say, if we recall that of the estimated 39.8 million estimated fishers, 97% live in the developing world and 90% work in small-scale fisheries. Small-scale fisheries account for around 50% of global wild-caught fish. And as she mentioned, 90 to 95% of the small-scale fisheries catch in developing countries is consumed locally. And what these figures do is they highlight the importance to food security, to local livelihoods, to local economies that cannot be replaced by other sources of these fisheries resources. So when we see subsidies damaging them, you are directly damaging the lives and livelihoods of many poor people. So at that, I think I'd like to pause and ask to show the film, which I think explains in a graphic way what we're talking about here today. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. And so now, without further ado, let's watch the film, Fisheries on the Brink, How Heavily Subsidized Industrial Fishing is Threatening the Survival of Small-Scale Fishing.
These fishes, they are catching the fish that the artisanal fishermen depend on it. And this is our livelihood since we were born, and we have nowhere to go. So we need help along the world. If our country couldn't help us, and some people can help us, we need help. We are getting out of business and we are dying. Seriously, we need help. That's what I can say.
Our ocean is in a state of crisis. Overfishing and illegal fishing are fueling the collapse of marine ecosystems around the world. And according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, over 90% of global fish populations are fished at or beyond sustainable levels. This is a critical food security issue for the 3 billion people around the world who depend on fish as a primary source of protein. Among these, the coastal communities of West Africa are largely dependent on fish for food and income, but heavily subsidized industrial vessels from developed states are catching the fish that local, small-scale fishers have depended on for generations. And now these stocks are facing collapse.
Looking back in the last 10 years, decline has been systematic. Every year it reduces. Every year it reduces. And this year there hasn't been any fish at all. And therefore it looks like we have reached the collapse of our fishery, or artisanal fishery in Ghana.
It has been continuous decline throughout the year. Year by year, fish catch keep decreasing. And this year has been the worst of it. As we speak this morning, fishermen who went to sea made no catch.
Subsidies allow industrial distant water vessels to operate in areas that are so severely depleted that they would otherwise be unviable. When operating costs are artificially slashed, for example by subsidizing consumables like bait and fuel, these vessels can continue to chase the last remaining fish, with catastrophic results for the marine ecosystem and the people that depend on it. As such, these subsidies can promote illegal fishing and overfishing.
I do not see the future of fishing in Ghana, because if the subsidies for the industrial tourists continues, it will continue to deplete the stock beyond recognition. And at the moment, the stock keeps on dwindling or depleting. And if it continues like what we are seeing, the future of fishing in Ghana will be a very hopeless state.
If business remains as usual, then our fishing has no future. In no time, we'll be out of business, and the livelihood of over 2.7 million Ghanaians who depend on fisheries is at risk. It is a threat to food security, it is a threat to income security, it is a threat to job security, and it is a threat to national security. It is a serious thing that authorities will have to relook at it and clamp down on the activities of these industrial trawlers to save our artisanal fisheries before it goes into total collapse.
This same story is playing out in coastal fisheries and on the high seas the world over. Governments provide around $22 billion every year in subsidies that increase fishing capacity and encourage fishing beyond profitable and sustainable levels. It jeopardizes the very resource that the future of the industry is dependent on.
Fishermen are facing stiff competition from industrial trawlers. They are hugely subsidized by their respective governments, making the cost of operation cheaper or moderate to them, for which reason they are able to roam the length and breadth of the sea, competing hugely with the artisanal fishers.
We have a unique opportunity this year in negotiations at the World Trade Organization to enact meaningful reform. The global community must honour its commitment, also enshrined in Sustainable Development Goal 14 and agreed by the UN General Assembly, to eliminate the harmful subsidies that are destroying our ocean, harming fishing communities around the world, and fueling overcapacity and overfishing. We must act urgently to save our ocean.
Wow. I've watched that film myself now between 5 and 10 times, and I have to say every time I watch it, it hits me at the heart. I find it very moving. I'm sure you'll agree that it's very touching expose of the real situation, and sets out plainly and confrontingly how the practices of subsidizing large-scale industrial fleets to overfish in distant waters is having a devastating impact on small-scale fishing communities. We're joined, as you know, by the former chief fisherman of Elmina, Nana Jojo Solomon. Hope you can hear me, Nana. We've just heard you say that there are days when you can't find a single fish, and that the small-scale fishing sector in Ghana is under severe threat. Do you think we can describe the attempt to ban harmful fisheries subsidies at the WTO as the last hope for your community? Nana, over to you.
Certainly, certainly. I mean, the title even speaks for itself. It's harmful. Anything that is harmful, it's not good. You understand? And Ghana is a country that has its own traditions and customs. We don't fish on Tuesdays. It's just a way of also, fishing sustainably. You understand? So it doesn't even make sense for foreign trawlers to come, with heavy subsidies to be able to fish 24/7 without knowing any day of the week. They are in our waters, and already there's overcapacity. There's so much effort out there. We're even looking to add in extra fishing holidays like Sunday. We've engaged government. We are looking at capping the number of fleets that is in our waters. We've asked government that come 2020, the end of 2020, December 31st, we won't have any more canoes out there. We want to cut down on the size of fleets that canoe fishing fleets that we have currently. So it doesn't even make sense for foreign trawlers to be heavily subsidized to come with all the gadgets on board to render fish easily caught, to come into our waters and deplete our stocks. This year is obviously, it's clear that that our fisheries is on the verge of collapse, just like the scientists have rightly said, and we are witnessing it. We don't land fish. A canoe can embark on fishing for about 2-3 months without landing a single fish. Understand? So I think, and like we rightly saw in the film, canoe small-scale fisheries takes care of about 60 to 70% of local fish content or protein content in this country. It also looks at job security. We create jobs for jobs that government can ordinarily cannot give out there. We create jobs for ourselves. So there's job security also in question. There's also food security aspect of it, and ultimately national security, because the devil finds job for those who are idle. There's nothing to do. More especially, what makes it more dangerous is that now we have oil and gas, and therefore we have all manner of people within the fishing communities, which makes it more dangerous. And therefore, I think that we are looking at about over 300 fishing communities, vulnerable communities. It's a livelihood, and it's a culture, and we are looking at it. Eventually with its imminent collapse, and for us, it's not acceptable. So I think this is indeed an opportunity to call on the WTO, because at the end of the day, if nothing is done about it, we will carry our empty plates to the international communities to feed us. And right now, with the government's policy, Ghana Beyond Aid, this is not the time for us to be seeking for aid here and there. We want to, as artisanal fishers, congratulate EJF, especially Steve Trent, on the fantastic job, on the fact that he's built the capacity of artisanal fishers to know the truth and know what is happening. So these things were known to us, you understand? And therefore, we'll still collaborate with EJF and all well-meaning NGOs and civil society organizations to bring this absurdness to a halt and be able to. Fortunately for us, fisheries is, one of the only natural resource that is self-renewable, and therefore we still think that there's light at the end of the tunnel. But with some of these practices, especially the subsidies, for these industrial trawlers must cease, must stop, because it allows them to fish efficiently 24/7 indiscriminately without conscience. And for us, it is a little bit absurd, and that must stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nana, for sharing these thoughts. It's much appreciated, and I hope that your message is received loud and clear in Geneva at the WTO.
Fantastic.
Please do stay with us, as I'm sure people will have questions for you in due course. We currently have well over 100 people, 126 I can see in my my counter online. If you would like to ask questions to Nana or any of our speakers, please share them in the Zoom chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to respond in the Q&A session just a bit later on. So now I'd like to turn to Brian O'Riordan from the Low Impact Fishers of Europe platform. Good afternoon, Brian. You're based in Brussels, and your constituency is the Small Scale Fishers of Europe, though you were a fisherman yourself in Ireland in a previous life. After watching the film from Ghana and listening to Steve and Nana, what would you say are the parallels between their situation and that of small scale fishers in Europe? And what is your view of these WTO negotiations? Thanks.
Thank you, Gemma, and thanks to Friends of Ocean Action for the opportunity to be part of this important seminar. It's a very moving film, as you said, and I was listening intently to what Nana had to say and what Steve was saying earlier. And certainly I see many parallels with what's happening in Ghana and what's happening in Europe. The small-scale fishing in Europe is a seasonally diverse fishery, traditionally, using passive gears, hooks and lines, gill nets, set nets, which have very low impact on the bottom. They're highly selective. And the main feature of the small-scale fisheries in Europe is that they're day boats. They go out daily and they bring back a fresh catch, which has a high economic value and a high nutritional value, which is quite a different product to the fish which is brought back from days which may spend 5 to 10 days at sea. And the fish, although in good condition, is not absolutely as fresh as it is if it's landed on the day. So the issue of providing food, providing jobs, traditional livelihoods, all the traditional knowledge that has been built up by the fishers over the years is being put at risk by fishing policies which are blind to the small-scale fishery. In fact, we call our fleet, which funnily enough represents over 80% of the vessel numbers, 80% of the vessel numbers of the European fleet and 40% of the employment, but it only lands 5% by weight. This fleet is almost entirely forgotten by the European policies, which since the post-war era of the 1950s, the Treaty of Rome and so on, the fishing policies have focused mainly on industrialization and providing jobs. So the whole idea of rooting livelihoods in communities which depend on fishing, if those fishing jobs go away, then there's very little else in those communities. So what we've seen happening over the years in Europe is that the use of subsidies has been engineering social, economic, and environmental change in ways which is basically, I think the words of the UNCTAD describe it very well. Basically, taxpayers' money is being used to subsidize fishing companies, individual fishing companies, to degrade the environment and undermine the food security of local communities around the world. And this is what we want to have stopped. It's not that subsidizing in itself is bad, it's how the money is being used. And our mantra in life is very much, this is a public resource, and public money is being used to undermine that resource. What we would like to see is the public money, the taxpayers' money, being used to fund activities which are of public benefit. So what we would like to see is collective projects. We would like to see a level playing field between small scale and large scale. What we have in Europe is what can only be described as a completely distorted sea, where the small scale sector, as I said earlier, lands only 5% of the catch, yet employs 40% of the jobs and 80% of the fleet. So we would like to see better access to resources and better access to markets for the small scale fleet, which again are part of the SDG 14. What role the WTO can play in all of this, I think, is a crucial question. Obviously, the WTO sets the global rules, and member states and the international community then have to apply those rules. So without an international framework in which subsidies can be judged and classified, then essentially people like me, people like Nana, people like Steve, who are advocating change, are working in the dark because there is no guiding framework. All we've got is what Steve mentioned earlier. We are striving for fisheries which are more ethical, which are more socially just. And part of the job of life is to right the historic wrongs in Europe, which have seen 95% of the quota being allocated to the industrial sector, which means that the small-scale fleet are very limited in what they're allowed to catch. If we catch the quota species, which are the main species, then we are penalized. We're only allowed to catch the non-quota species. So we would like to see a complete realignment and a reallocation of quotas using subsidies for that. that would be a beneficial use of subsidies in our book, would be to subsidize the redistribution of the access to the fishing grounds and the fishing quotas, and an opening up of the fishing markets for small-scale products to be sold there, so the small-scale fishermen can benefit from the inherent value added of their products. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's interesting to see the parallels, and certainly good to see that small-scale fishers are mobilizing. And as you say, it's very much the point of this process and of SDG 14.6 is to eliminate harmful subsidies or perverse subsidies that encourage overfishing and overcapacity. And eliminating harmful fisheries subsidies would free considerable resources for what we call positive subsidies, or state support for sustainable fisheries practices and sustainable development more broadly. So we're doing pretty well on time and are already getting a good number of questions coming in. So we'll do our best to address as many of those as possible. But before we get to the Q&A session, I would like to ask Christelle Pratt from the Organization of the African, Caribbean and Pacific States to react, please, to what we've watched and heard, noting, of course, that Ghana is a member state of your organization. Christelle, thanks. Christelle, I think, are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thanks.
Apologies for that. But to all who are joining us virtually from across the blue planet, a very good afternoon to you all from a sunny Brussels. On behalf of the OACPS, I'd like to thank the Friends of Ocean Action and the Environmental Justice Foundation for the invitation to comment on the film that has been launched today. The film is very effective. It highlights the serious impacts of harmful fisheries subsidies on the small-scale fishing sector of coastal communities of Ghana. But the same story could be told for the many other coastal communities of countries of Africa and the world over, for that matter. And the film states this. From the small villages dotting the coastlines of the OACPS members, small-scale fisheries provides livelihoods to millions. It plays an important and irreplaceable role in food security and nutrition, as we've heard from previous speakers. It provides employment for many, contributing substantially to local economies and in turn economic growth. It is also the mainstay of our cultural well-being, as Nana bore out in his intervention and in the film. However, due to the nature of the sector being largely rural and dispersed over large spaces, its contribution is not properly quantified nor acknowledged. As a consequence, it is often marginalised or overlooked in political processes, which in turn means that it lacks the supporting policy framing and practice support needed. The producers of the film must be congratulated for making a film with a strong and simple message and a clear and compelling case for improved fisheries governance and the need to focus on a sector that is becoming increasingly challenged from competition for fishing resources by heavily subsidized fishing fleets, and also from the impacts of the greatest threat and challenge of our time, and that is climate change. For the past decade or so, members of the OACPS have been at the forefront in efforts to reform harmful fisheries subsidies in order to positively impact the health of fish stocks and biodiversity, and to secure the livelihoods of dependent communities and local economies. Eliminating or redirecting the estimated US $22 billion spent annually to incentivize the operations of the large industrial fishing vessels responsible for overfishing and illegal fishing is a bonus for ocean biodiversity and the millions of livelihoods that depend on it. As we approach the deadline set for the realisation of SDG 14.6, WTO members have a responsibility by the end of this year to secure an agreement that prohibits certain forms of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity, and eliminate subsidies for IUU fishing, with special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries. OACPS countries have genuine interests in achieving a successful outcome under the WTO that prohibits harmful fisheries subsidies so as to secure the crucial role that is the lifeline for many of our peoples. Recent studies have clearly shown that reforming harmful fisheries subsidies could lead to higher yields for local fishers, which in turn could help provide more stable jobs, raise fishers' incomes, reduce poverty, and improve food security in local communities. And we've heard this borne out in previous interventions. As would be expected, when stocks become overfished, as is clearly illustrated in the film, the highly mobile subsidized industrial fleets will shift to new fishing zones with better fishing opportunities. Left behind are the coastal small-scale fisheries who bear the brunt of the ecological damage caused by overfishing. And this can last for many years, even with the best stock rebuilding efforts, and with cascading effects and impacts on the communities concerned. In this context, subsidies that are specifically targeted at improving the economic viability of small-scale fisheries should be at the heart of the exceptions negotiated at the WTO, so as to enable vulnerable small-scale fisheries to mitigate against the impacts of overfishing and to improve the economic and environmental conditions of small-scale local fishers. On behalf of the OACPS Secretary General, I want to congratulate everyone that was involved in the making of the film. It brings to the fore the unflattering consequences of the activities of the heavily subsidized distant water fishing fleets operating in fishing zones around the coastal countries of Africa and around the island nations in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. The message should be clear. That is, for every dollar spent on capacity enhancing subsidies that cause overfishing, there is a very real cost borne by an anonymous person in a remote coastal village that has every right to live a free and worthwhile life. This is the human dimension to the problem. We of the OACPS hope that the film launched today will be used as a powerful advocacy tool for creating a heightened awareness of this critical issue, and will catalyse and mobilise people to take action and empower those involved in the negotiations in the WTO. I thank you again.
Thank you so much, Christelle. And I think you articulated so well what this film brings to the fore, as you say, the human dimension of what is actually at stake here. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Now, before we turn to Ambassador Thompson, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, we would like to take some questions from the floor. We've heard a great range of perspectives and points of view. And I think one good question that is worth kind of putting on the table now is that someone has said, we find it difficult to differentiate between how exactly the artisanal or small scale fisheries are demarcated compared to large scale or industrial fishing. And that would be helpful, I think, to a definition of terms, let's say. So maybe, Brian, would you be able to have a shot at that one, please?
Thanks, Gemma. I think what stands out for small scale fisheries is their diversity. So what may be small-scale artisanal fisheries in one part of the world may not be considered as such in another. But I think for me what stands out is their very, very close links with the sea on the one hand and the fishing communities on the other. The artisanal fisheries around the world provide a very important social and economic link between the activity at sea, the activity on land, providing of food, which is critical for people's food security, their cultural traditions. There's the element of traditional knowledge, which plays a very important role in the behavior of the fishers, where they fish, when they fish, what species of fish they catch. Obviously, size is important, but there we find in countries like Senegal, maybe ocean-going pirogues, 60 meters long, which is not small by anyone's reckoning. But the number of fishermen who are actually aboard these boats is relatively high. So maybe 15, 20 crew are going to sea in these large boats. So the boat is providing a lot of employment. But I think ultimately what we're talking about is a artisanal way of life compared to an industrialized way of life, where the artisan is the master of their craft and not depending so much on the technology to extract the fish. So knowledge and skill play a very high role in the small-scale fishery, whereas in the industrial fishery, it's more or less the industrial extraction, which is highly dependent on sophisticated technology. But you're not going to be able to come up with a global definition of small-scale fisheries. Many people have tried, and the discussion still goes on. In Europe, we define it as a cutoff point. All vessels under 12 meters are small in scale, so long as they're not using towed gear. That is the rule of thumb we use for, in fact, the subsidies. And as has been pointed out by one member in the audience from Client Earth, the majority of the subsidies goes to the vessel fleet that is over 12 meters and uses towed gear. So the lion's share, 90% of the subsidies, go to the larger scale, more industrial fleet. And this is why we have such a distorted fishery situation in Europe.
Right, got it. Thanks a lot, Brian. And as you say, an exact definition of terms that can be considered global or universal is perhaps impossible to find. But looking at the painting behind Nana depicting the traditional canoe fisheries in Ghana, I think is probably pretty much enough to define what artisanal fisheries means. Nana, we had a question that I might put to you that came in. Someone has said, how can we deal with the fact that small scale or individual fishing vessels need support from their governments? And I guess that's kind of defines this perverse situation where the subsidies go to large scale vessels. If those harmful fishery subsidies are eliminated, then there would be positive subsidies could be channeled to support smaller scale fishermen. What would you say to that point?
Yes, I think it would be a move in the right direction that once these subsidies to the industrial trawlers, are halted, then I believe that the subsidies or the funds can be channeled into capacity building of the artisanal fishers, so that we also indulge in harmful types of fishing, like on the side mesh, some using carbide and chemicals and light fishing, which is also another source of worry to us. And it is all as a result of the fact that there's no fish, people are desperate, and they adopt all measure of practices to be able to feed the family. So I believe that once these things are halted, naturally the stocks will revamp, but the only way for the stocks to revamp is to also engage the fishers in what we term as sustainable fisheries. Most of our fishermen lack the capacity to do the right thing. And it is also as a result of the fact that the industry has been neglected, or the artisanal industry has also been neglected by the regulators. And then they look on for all manner of practices. So I believe that that is all we are asking for, is to build the capacity of the fisher to know that their entire livelihood depends on this vocation. It's a tradition and a custom, and that we need to protect it. So I think it's just about capacity building.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nana. And when we talk about the harmful subsidies and how we break down what that exactly means, fuel subsidies seem to account for a massive proportion of those. But it looks like some countries are resistant to removing those, as someone commented. And the question is, are there any suggestions for helping eliminate these fuel subsidies in particular? Steve, do you maybe want to have any points on that?
So it's a difficult question to answer. I think fuel subsidies are critical, and not least because you will find if you examine them in detail, you will see that the distant water fleets of countries are very often being heavily subsidized. It's stating the obvious because they're steaming across vast areas of the ocean. I think we need to look at subsidies in the round, though, rather than try and put them in silos and ghettoize the different parts of it, and say that harmful fishery subsidies, whether they're providing for crew or fuel or equipment or anything, are all the same, and we need to eradicate them. And I'd make one simple point in saying this. If we achieve sustainable fisheries, the whole world wins. If we carry on with business as usual, then the poor coastal communities we've seen will definitely lose. But ultimately, in the final analysis, the whole world will lose. So we have a shared and common interest. There's a win-win in this. It's not setting one faction against another or pursuing one particular partisan interest. This is a global common mission we have. And it's one I believe we can succeed in.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. Let's hope so. And there's a question now about fisheries partnership agreements, and maybe Nana, you could share a few thoughts on that. Someone says, how will it be that? Sorry, can you speak to the issue of the payments under fisheries partnership agreements to the government in Ghana, and what is the position of the government in that regard, as far as you're aware?
The payments from the industrial trawlers to, I think for us, we are artisanal fishers. We lack transparency as far as the entire industry is concerned when it comes to the regulators. It's not all the information that they put out there. So one thing we know for sure is that some Ghanaian businessmen and front for these foreign-owned trawlers, because it is not in our laws, it is not allowed for foreigners to engage in fishing. So this is, because a few times we've had the occasion to interact with the supposed owners of these vessels, and they tell us that they can't even control the the expatriates on the vessel. So then we realize that if you own the vessel, how come you can't control them? So obviously what we are hearing may be the gospel truth. And I think I will leave part of this question to EJF, because they have done an extensive investigation and in-depth investigation into how licenses are procured, and they can lead us into it. But it's definitely fisheries transparency is also on the very low side as far as Ghana is concerned. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nana. And another question for you, actually, that has come in regarding flag states. What flag states most visit Ghanaian waters?
Predominantly, they are Chinese. They all look alike. It gets to a point you can't even tell who the Korean is and who the Chinese is. But they are definitely the Asian, from the Asian countries. Yes, that we are sure about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So another question coming in, I'm going to ask this one to Brian. Given the impact of distant water fishing, is it fair to say that all subsidies provided to fleets that fish beyond national jurisdiction should be classed as harmful? Would a prohibition of that sort help small-scale local fishers to recover and rebuild their capacity?
Interesting question. I think that would need to be looked at more closely, and especially what you mean by subsidy, because we know that some subsidies, like the fuel subsidy you mentioned earlier, are quite easy to track and trace, whereas other subsidies, for instance, having vessel licenses paid for by the government, or having vessel licenses subsidized in some hidden way, may mean that vessels fishing outside the waters in which they're flagged can benefit from these subsidies. Also, you mentioned earlier about the vessels which may be of foreign ownership. They may be owned by European, Chinese, Taiwanese, or international capital, and they're flagged to countries like Ghana. So these vessels, given your description, would be able to avail of the subsidies because they are registered in a country where they're fishing. So I think the whole issue of the registration of the vessels needs to be looked at, and that the term beneficial ownership should be used more coherently in fisheries legislation to ensure that a vessel which is flagged in Ghana doesn't show up as a Ghanaian vessel, but shows up as a vessel belonging to the company which actually owns that vessel. So the flag needs to be traced back to the capital which actually is responsible for that vessel fishing where it is. And I think we need a more general classification of what is a harmful subsidy, rather than trying to come up with something which prohibits subsidies from vessels fishing outside of the waters where they are registered. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brian. We have a comment here coming in that the involvement of organizations like OACPS and EJF in the WTO negotiations will be very important, and it's good to see you both present here. What further work do those organizations have planned to support the negotiations? Perhaps, Christelle, I can put that to you first. You're on mute.
Okay, here we go. I'll learn by the end of the webinar.
I've done it so many times.
In terms of the negotiations, I'm sure everybody is aware that the OACPS have been and remain actively engaged in the negotiations, and you know, really that is all I really want to say, because I do feel it's in the interest of our member states, and we will remain engaged up to the bitter end. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve, what about the Environmental Justice Foundation?
Well, I think we have a small role to play. What I would point to is the fundamental need to have the voices of the people who live from these resources and who suffer from their mismanagement. So I think it is voices like Nana Jojo Solomon and others, people from the developing world, whatever geography they're in, whether they're in Southeast Asia, in West Africa, East Africa, those are the voices that we need to hear in the negotiations, because as I've said, they depend upon these resources. So we will continue our work to try and amplify the messages coming from those communities and bring them to the fore. Because I think most of the people on this webinar could probably predict what I will say. But I think hearing the true voice and the message from those coastal communities and those artisanal fishers, small scale fishers, is key.
Absolutely, second that 100%. Thanks, Steve. We have a comment coming here that we've heard very movingly and compellingly from Ghana and Nana and that community, the impact which subsidized foreign fishing fleets are having on the small scale fleets there. Christelle, are you seeing the same or hearing about the same impacts and concerns in the Pacific? And if so, to what extent and in which ways? Thank you. Sorry, you're on mute.
Is that right? Are we good?
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I'll learn. I think as the film stated, I mean, of course, the film here is about Ghana and you know, shines a spotlight on Ghana. But I think the film also states that the same can be said the world over. And so we're seeing, you know, the same sorts of trends in the Pacific region, as I'm sure we're seeing in the Caribbean, in Asia, and you know, other regions around the world. And so really more to just suggest that, you know, the film itself provides some very, you know, provides a very compelling case and shines a spotlight on Ghana, but that you could replace that with the same of communities in other places around the Blue Planet. And I suspect that the stories will be as depressing as the ones that we hear from Nana and other Ghanaians in the film. Thank you.
Thanks, Christelle. And now here's a question. Could we prohibit subsidies to vessels not flying the flag of the subsidizing country? I guess that's a critical one. I'm not sure who might be able to comment on that. Brian, perhaps, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yes, I mean, one thing is the subsidies which come from national governments to their fleets. So that might be quite an interesting one. The other thing is the way that international capital is able to launder credit or subsidies which may be given in one country and make them appear in another country. So I think such a system would need to have some tracking of how a government may source the capital it is using to subsidize the fleet. It sounds like an interesting way of dealing with the problem, but I think there is so much under the water when it comes to the flow of capital internationally that the international fleet would find a way around it. I'm much more interested in the idea of coming up with some classification of what constitutes harmful subsidies in terms of how the money is used rather than where the money comes from. Because where the money comes from is an extremely difficult issue to follow and to be sure of.
Got it. Thanks for that, Brian. And one coming in now, again about flag states. I'm going to first ask Steve, maybe for you to share a few comments, and then Nana. Are the foreign fleets fishing off the coasts of Ghana flying flags from the countries of the beneficial owners, or are they reflagged by Ghana? If so, will they benefit from the special and differential treatment clause enshrined in the WTO and Sustainable Development Goal 14.6? Steve.
Well, I think that this is a great question, and I put it very simply in that the first thing is that the special and differential treatment clause would not apply because these vessels, the true beneficial owner is Chinese, the subsidy is coming from China. So if you look into this, you can see that there's no cause for that clause to be applied. But also one other point that I think we must make, and that is if you allow or facilitate these kind of loopholes and let them take root, you would gut SDG 14.6. It would have no purpose whatsoever. You would be giving everybody a route around this. And let's not forget that these SDG goals were effectively agreed by the world. These are not something that are being foisted on anyone. They're shared and common views of what we need to do. So I think it's critical that we understand where and how loopholes can be applied, and we look to close them. So no, if you look at the vessels off the coast of Ghana, you can see 90% plus true beneficial owners in Chinese, and all they've done is register a front company to facilitate the application of the Ghanaian flag and thereby make it quasi-legal under Ghanaian law.
Thank you. Nana, is there anything you would add to that?
Yes, I think Steve has said it all, and what makes it a bit, questionable is that they are supposed to be Ghanaian-owned vessels, but they have Chinese crew and they bear Chinese names. So therefore, you ask yourself, is there kind of opaqueness that is within the sector? You understand? And the regulators hardly want to divulge any information. All they tell you is that it belongs to Ghanaians, period. So I think it takes more than just the artisanal fishers to know the true ownership of these vessels. Thank you.
Many thanks. Thanks for that, Nana. And another one for Steve has just come in. Following on from your comments just now, Steve, has the impact of harmful fisheries subsidies been linked to the topic of economic migration and other social issues in the countries you're working in, from what you've observed?
What you can see, yes, is displacement. I mean, I'm privileged enough to have actually been in many of these coastal communities where we make these films, and to have spent time with the fishers and others in the community. And what you can see is, when the fishery is damaged and it declines as a result of the subsidies, you see people have no option but to move. And very often they're forced into urban centres where there are very few livelihood opportunities. You see people forced from their communities. Across the Gulf of Guinea, West Africa, you can see a similar pattern. And unfortunately, you can see, as it's been mentioned by Christelle Pratt and others, you can see similar situations virtually wherever you look, and you have poorer coastal communities. So yes, it does drive forced migration. And the real challenge we have to look at here is that in a country like Ghana, in the central Cape Coast district, in and around the communities there are very few other livelihoods to be had. So if you damage the fishery, you are damaging their ability to maintain their communities, their social and economic well-being, and the coherence there.
Thanks for that, Steve. That's clear. And following on from that, another question for Nana is asking whether are the impacts of harmful fishing subsidies and the knock-on impacts on fisher people's livelihoods and communities, is that situation being linked to the topic of economic migration, fishing communities who end up without jobs and seek employment in countries that are fishing on their coasts, for example, the EU, the bigger picture of migration?
Exactly so. Exactly so. Currently, if you look at the abject poverty along our fishing communities, and those who are rescued by Italian coastal guards on the Libyan desert, they're predominantly fishermen. There's nothing to live for anymore. There's nothing to live for anymore, and therefore, they will have to migrate. That's it. I mean, they'll have to migrate. And I think a lot, watching from CNN, most of them have been interviewed, and all they say is that their livelihoods are almost gone. I mean, they have nothing to live for, and therefore they will risk their lives for greener pastures. Most of those caught by coastal guards and rescued by coastal guards and on the deserts are all predominantly fishermen. So it's a little bit sad. And if you visit the fishing communities along the 300 plus coastal communities, you will see for yourself the abject poverty. So it is linked to the migration of the people from the coastal communities.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Nana. Another question for you. How does the tuna fishing fleet active in Ghana's waters figure in the subsidies and overfishing story? Are the fleets locally owned? That's tuna vessels.
Yes, I think with the tuna vessels, yes, most of them, there's a collaboration between, and I think the law allows it, that it should be, it's a partnership thing, and it's also controlled by ICAT. So you really see some kind of sanity and discipline within the tuna sector. I don't think we really have issues with this tuna sector, except for the trout sector. Thank you.
Thank you. And another question that's come in about the role of civil society and other voices in this negotiating process, because it can seem quite a technical niche topic that doesn't always meet with broad global general media coverage. We're doing our best to change that, and hopefully this film will get seen quite far and wide. But what role do you think civil society and other players have in this issue and in this negotiating process, where there's just weeks left for WTO members to reach a deal in Geneva or over Zoom, given the situation that we're currently in by December? Perhaps, Christelle, could I put that to you first, please?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
I really must admit that I cannot comment on the part of the OACPS, given that I'm really very new in the post. However, perhaps just to share something of my recent history, and that is, as part of the Pacific Islands Forum, under the framework for Pacific regionalism, one of the guiding principles of that particular regionalism framework is inclusivity, and a very open public policy process that involves civil society, private sector, as well as governments. I just share that as an example where one would think that all of the decisions that we make going forward that that have an impact on each of us as individuals and then making up our countries should be an important tenet. But on the part of the OACPS, I'm afraid I really cannot comment at this stage in terms of positions around inclusivity. Thank you.
That makes sense. Thanks, Christelle. Brian, what do you think about the role of civil society?
Well, there's a saying that you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it admire the view. So civil society have a very informal role. They have a political role. They have a number of levers which they can apply generally to their own national delegates. But at the end of the day, we're in the hands of the decision makers. And if the political will isn't there in the WTO, I mean, we've seen this process going on for nearly 20 years. It's as long as the Doha process is long. Then, quite frankly, we're going to have to find a different way of going about it. But for sure, I mean, we've got 2 months to go, everything to play for. So for all those civil society organizations who are engaged with the negotiations, now is the time, the final push. And I agree wholeheartedly with what Steve was saying earlier, that the voices of the small-scale fishers, the voices of the fishing communities around the world who are so negatively affected by these subsidies must be heard by the decision makers in the WTO, because they have the story to tell. They can, with their own personal experiences, they can explain exactly how these subsidies are impacting on their communities and forcing them to migrate away from the coast, away from their traditional livelihoods, often to very difficult and harsh conditions in urban environments with lack of employment possibilities, lack of living space, so on and so forth.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Brian. Steve, what's your view of the role of civil society and trying to break through in the raising awareness around this issue?
I think it's good. I think it can be critical. The words of Margaret Mead come to mind about nothing has ever changed without the actions of a small group of committed individuals. And I think civil society, large or small, can be that group of committed individuals to drive change and to generate the political will. I would hope that our politicians would understand the core element in this, which is the need for sustainability, and as I mentioned before, that everybody wins from that. But sometimes they don't, and I would be foolish and naive not to recognise the competing pressures in the world. So my call to civil society is to say, get involved, get active, and create the future you want. Have a part in these negotiations and discussions, make your voice heard, and hopefully together we'll get the results that we want.
Absolutely. Many thanks. Thanks for that, Steve. And Nana, just before we go to Peter Thompson to share some remarks, I wonder if I could just ask you, we've got over 100 people online, including some people representing those missions in Geneva and other key constituents. What's your key message, would you say, to the WTO members in Geneva who are negotiating this deal to eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies?
My message is very simple, that the coastal communities depending on the small-scale fisheries across the continent of Africa and other places, like Chris just said, are on life support. So this is an SOS message to the international communities who have the power to reverse this unfortunate trend. Otherwise, we're going to have more serious issues on our hands globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nana, and everybody for that session. The time's gone quickly, actually, and we want to make sure we have time for our last speaker. So it's very timely and inspiring to shed some light on where small-scale fishers stand with regards to the ongoing discussions at the WTO. And we have a good number of delegates online with us now. And I hope we've brought a sense of reality and urgency and humanity to their work. It's not only about saving fish, it's also about preventing human suffering and protecting human lives, livelihoods and cultures. Ambassador Thompson, Special Ocean Envoy of the UN Secretary General, we know this issue is very close to your heart, and we'd love to hear some brief thoughts from you. You have the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gemma. I've been scribbling notes, listening to the speakers. It's been a really fascinating hour and a half that we've spent together from the field and from the expert officers. So I'm gonna have to put on my reading glasses to read what I've put down here, but it was mainly all a reaction to what we've heard. But, first of all, I just really want to thank Environmental Justice Foundation and also the people of Elmina in Ghana for that film. Fantastic. It really got to the heart of it. And I hope that it'll be widely spread in terms of social media and other formats. And I'm really asking my colleague, Nana Jojo Solomon, to let his people know that, they're not alone in this. There's a worldwide team out there fighting on this issue for the rights of artisanal fishers and the abolition of of harmful subsidies under SDG 14.6. In this fight, I'm not neutral. There's so many things a UN ambassador has to be neutral on, but this I'm not. I'm definitely in the blue corner fighting for SDG 14.6 and the target SDG 14B. So that's artisanal fishers, and that's ending these harmful fisheries subsidies. To continue the boxing analogy of being in the blue corner, I would say that as far as SDG 14.6 is concerned, it's round 14 in a 15-round fight. So, let's just pace ourselves a little bit here, but we are about to go into the 15th round, and we got to deliver that knockout blow of abolishing these harmful subsidies for all time. I've been in West Africa and down in the fishing villages and on the beaches amongst the boats talking to the fishermen. And I agree with one of the comments that was made earlier that, you know, the alternates are not good when you can no longer catch fish. For the families for generations have invested in these boats. This is their capital and it's lying idle on the beach. Well, you have to use it in some way. And the alternates are not good on that. So, you know, it's really important that we safeguard those coastal fisheries and allow fishers to carry on with their traditional vocation. I think a third thing that I would say there, though, is that, you know, and I was part of the creation of the SDGs, you know, back at the United Nations in 2014, 2015, intense negotiations. Everybody was involved, night after night, for years, to reach this very intricate collection of goals for what humanity needs to sustainably live on this planet. And the message I would say to countries that are making things difficult for us on SDG 14.6 is you can't cherry pick SDGs. They are an integrated package that all of us agreed to after those intense negotiations. So no cherry picking. The other thing I'd like to say is, you know, where is the logic? We know where, you know, we know where the money goes. There's logic in, you know, people filling their pockets, but where is the logic in public funds, our money being used for this madness? As Nana Jojo put it, there's madness, and I agree with him. So we put public funds to subsidize the hunt for diminishing supplies of fish, and in some cases to subsidize illegal hunting. You know, it's like subsidizing crime. SDG 14.6 is our undertaking to stop the madness, and we have the WTO General Council meeting this December to make that a reality. You know, FAO is adamant that the best form of conservation is better management. And the logical corollary of that is that the removal of harmful subsidies is a key element of better fisheries management. So for the sake of our relationship with nature on planet Earth, let's let none break the consensus on delivery of SDG 14.6 in December. Just to back that up, you know, as has already been said, SDG 14.6, it's a universal commitment made by the leaders of 193 member states of the United Nations. None of us stood aside on it. Overcapacity and overfishing are specifically targeted, as is illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. In essence, delivery on SDG 14.6 would bring an end to the current global predicament of too many ships chasing too few fish, added to which, as I've said, illegal fishing is a crime. So where does all this fit in terms of where we are with the recovery from COVID pandemic and so on? Governments should not complicate this. I know negotiations are tough, always are, but the government should not complicate it. You know, the basic fact is that industrial fleets are receiving over 80% of these harmful subsidies. Second basic point is that fish stocks globally are 34.2% overfished. And that's where the overcapacity comes in. And the third point is that the victims are the artisanal fishers in their millions, mainly spread around the coasts of developing countries. And I have been in Asia Pacific, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, along the coast of Africa, and that is a universal principle. The victims are the artisanal fishers. They're the ones who are having their goods stolen from them, their livelihoods stolen from them. And that's why we all agreed to SDG 14.6 in the first place. This is very much in harmony with the blue-green recovery road that we're all talking about for how we come out of the COVID pandemic in better shape than we went into it. In other words, in better relationship with nature and between ourselves in terms of equity, but mostly in terms of our ecosystems that we need to continue to survive on this planet. look, time is short, so let me just say this. The negotiators, you got a tough job. You know, there always is in a multinational setting, you know, tough negotiations. And you've got to battle on through into that 15th round now, which is about to get underway. But remember that, you know, there's going to be that final bell, and that the whole world expects that we will deliver on SDG 14.6 because we all agreed to it. So we want to see it honored when that final bell rings. I want to give a special shout out to Ambassador Santiago Wells, the chairman of the negotiating group, and to that cadre of, you know, really dedicated ambassadors who have joined this negotiation in Geneva during difficult times with the pandemic. They're doing a great job, but, you know, we really expect you to be holding up the trophy that we all want when that final bell rings in December at the WTO General Council. The final thing that I would say to you is UN Ocean Conference next year in Lisbon. Obviously, SDG 14.6 is going to come very much into the spotlight because it matures in 2020. But I would say the same about 14D on artisanal fishes. You know, there'll be a lot of attention on that. What are we actually doing to save our coastal communities? And if we can take that $22 billion worth of harmful subsidies and start getting that into the positive stuff for our coastal communities, sustainable aquaculture and all those things that we want in the blue-green recovery, I think we'll be able to hold our heads up high when we get to Lisbon. So I look forward to seeing you all in Lisbon next year.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter, for these inspiring words, as always. And as we near the end of this webinar, I'd just love to hand the floor over briefly to Steve Trent again of the Environmental Justice Foundation to share a word on what we've heard in this discussion.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say quickly, thanks again to Friends of Ocean Action and to each of the speakers today. I've certainly learned something, which I hope everybody else on this has. I'm going to be very brief and perhaps echo some of the words that Peter Thompson just said. I think it's vital that at that General Council meeting we achieve this goal. It is a goal rarely that the whole world set together in collaboration and agreed upon. We need to realise it. And I think the benefits of that for coastal communities, for artisanal fishers, for our marine environment, and for supporting the resilience that we need on our blue planet to deal with other challenges such as climate change are self-evident. We will be helping ourselves if we meet this goal. And I think history will judge the negotiators and their member states, their governments well, and applaud the leadership if we do this. I think, as I mentioned, and I'm not shy to say again, this is a win-win. We can do it, we must do it. And on a closing word, I'd say, you know, one of the things that I think about often when I go to sleep and when I wake up is I think of some of the people I've met over time who are victim of these subsidies and the abuses that go with them. And I see them struggling to feed their children or feed themselves, struggling to stay alive. It's not a question about quality of life. It's all too often really about life or death, actually. And so I think as we move forward this, keeping that thought in the front of our minds and saying, let's meet the goal that we agreed to achieve in December 2020, and then we can all celebrate a better, more hopeful future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Fully agree. And it's been really fantastic to work with you and the Environmental Justice Foundation on this webinar. The film really cuts straight to the core of why this issue matters most. And it will be now available publicly. There will be a press release. It should be available on our social media platforms, both Friends of Ocean Action and Environmental Justice Foundation, and websites. And we really encourage everyone to please share it as far and wide as you can. I believe we have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to close out with playing the film again. This is just 6 minutes, so even if that runs over a couple of minutes, please feel free to watch it. But all it remains for me to say is a big thank you again to all of our speakers and to all of you who've participated online. Let's really hope that the words and testimonies that we've heard today resonate in Geneva at the headquarters of the World Trade Organization. Negotiators have barely 2 months left to reach that deal to eliminate harmful fisheries subsidies. So we wish them well in that quest. The world is watching. So stay safe, everybody, and keep the ocean safe. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we will now watch the film again. Thanks again.
These fishes, they are catching the fish that the artisanal fishermen depend on it. And this is our livelihood since we were born, and we have nowhere to go. So we need help along the world. If our country couldn't help us, and some people can help us, we need help. We are getting out of business and we are dying. Seriously, we need help. That's what I can say.
Our ocean is in a state of crisis. Overfishing and illegal fishing are fueling the collapse of marine ecosystems around the world. And according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, over 90% of global fish populations are fished at or beyond sustainable levels. This is a critical food security issue for the 3 billion people around the world who depend on fish as a primary source of protein. Among these, the coastal communities of West Africa are largely dependent on fish for food and income, but heavily subsidized industrial vessels from developed states are catching the fish that local, small-scale fishers have depended on for generations. And now these stocks are facing collapse.
Looking back in the last 10 years, decline has been systematic. Every year it reduces, and this year there hasn't been any fish at all. And therefore it looks like we have reached the collapse of our fishery, or artisanal fishery in Ghana.
It has been continuous decline throughout the year. Year by year, fish catch keep decreasing. And this year has been the worst of it. As we speak this morning, fishermen who went to sea made no catch.
Subsidies allow industrial distant water vessels to operate in areas that are so severely depleted that they would otherwise be unviable. When operating costs are artificially slashed, for example by subsidizing consumables like bait and fuel, these vessels can continue to chase the last remaining fish, with catastrophic results for the marine ecosystem and the people that depend on it. As such, these subsidies can promote illegal fishing and overfishing.
I do not see the future of fishing in Ghana, because if the subsidies for the industrial trawlers continues, it will continue to deplete the stock beyond recognition. And at the moment, the stock keeps on dwindling or depleting. And if it continues like what we are seeing, the future of fishing in Ghana will be a very hopeless state.
If business remains as usual, then our fishing has no future. In no time, we'll be out of business, and the livelihood of over 2.7 million Ghanaians who depend on fisheries is at risk. It is a threat to food security, it is a threat to income security, it is a threat to job security, and it is a threat to national security. It is a serious thing that authorities will have to relook at it and clamp down on the activities of these industrial trawlers to save our artisanal fisheries before it goes into total collapse.
This same story is playing out in coastal fisheries and on the high seas the world over. Governments provide around $22 billion every year in subsidies that increase fishing capacity and encourage fishing beyond profitable and sustainable levels. It jeopardizes the very resource that the future of the industry is dependent on.
Fishermen are facing stiff competition from industrial trawlers. They are hugely subsidized by their respective governments, making the cost of operation cheaper or moderate to them, for which reason they are able to roam the length and breadth of the sea, competing hugely with the artisanal fishers.
We have a unique opportunity this year in negotiations at the World Trade Organization to enact meaningful reform. The global community must honour its commitment, also enshrined in Sustainable Development Goal 14 and agreed by the UN General Assembly, to eliminate the harmful subsidies that are destroying our ocean, harming fishing communities around the world, and fueling overcapacity and overfishing. We must act urgently to save our ocean.
Thank you very much again to everybody, to our speakers and to all of you who joined online. It's been really interesting discussion, a very important process. Please do continue to contribute to the process, and you can follow us on social media, and we'll be releasing the film on there and on our websites. Please do help spread the word far and wide. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Ambassador Thompson.